title of my talk is What Kind of Democracy is Candlelight Democracy? And it's in some ways it was a chance for me to revisit some of the past candlelight events over the last 15 years. And thanks again for the invitation from Director Lim, and it's a pleasure to be here as we kind of hash out this notion of candlelight democracy. So I guess in terms of the general context, which has been talked about today quite a lot so far, we can regard the candlelight revolution as this enormous moment of hope. It's some of the challenges facing Korean citizens are faced by many different political contexts around the world. You might think of the rise of Trump, of Brexit, of this tendency back towards regimes with authoritarian tendencies. And so Korea provides us this moment of hope. In some ways, it provides a possible future for social movements and politicians in other places. So I think it's a very important, topical thing to study. And also the very peaceful and horizontal nature of the revolution, too, is something that I think people in many different contexts find inspiring. So it's a really, really important subject. So I've been asked to talk about this relationship between direct democracy and SNS. And certainly, SNS was a big part of the revolution. But I think we want to avoid approaching social media as something like a technological fix for a governing regime. As important as things like rapid polling or e-government may be, I don't think this is what we want when we talk about direct democracy, although, of course, those things can be important. So instead of sort of focusing on social media, I want to really talk more about how we think, or how the candlelight revolution provides us an opportunity to not only think about direct democracy, but the relation between direct democracy and representative democracy. And indeed, this is a theme that Eric was just talking about, and it's come up in some of the other presentations. So I think if we want to think carefully about this relationship between direct mass mobilization and other forms of direct political action and representative democracy, there's some really interesting lessons here that can be gleaned from revisiting past events. And this is what I've done in this paper. It's still a working paper, but it's been enjoyable so far. So I've been looking back at some of the commentary on the 2008 protests against the imports of US beef, as well as the 2002-2004 candlelight vigils. And here some of the commentary talks about how these protests, especially the ones against Lee Myung-bak, represented a revolt against a style of politics that we may associate with the term delegative democracy. This is a concept by Guillermo O'Donnell, the democratic transition theorist, but one that's also used by Korean political theorists like Choi Jang-jip. And really what O'Donnell was arguing is that this was a kind of outcome of democratization in Latin America. He argued that a democratic transition did not necessarily lead to democratic consolidation, but that you could get this condition that he called delegative democracy, a kind of system with strong executive power and a lot of contempt for opposition parties, civil society, and some of the key institutions of democracy, the judiciary, law, etc. And he saw this as being a kind of durable condition. It was something that was existent and that could last, that there's no guaranteed outcome out of it. So some scholars said that the 2008 candlelight mad cow protests were kind of a revolt against this kind of delegative style. There's a picture of O'Donnell. So Choi Jang-jip, he picked up this argument in his writings, and he argued that Korea also shared some characteristics of delegative democracy, in particular the weakness of representative democracy. And he argued that there were some different reasons for this. One is that the experience of the Cold War had in some ways made it very difficult to accurately represent the political spectrum, to accurately represent the politics of the left in particular. It's very difficult to be even a social democrat sometimes in Korea. So instead of accurately representing the political spectrum, parties and politicians opted for what Che called a strategic ambiguity. But this kind of lessened their accountability. It lessened their ability to accurately represent questions of social inequality and social injustice. And he writes, the relations between voter support and the responsibility of elected officials is very loose and ambiguous, rather than concrete and direct. Che also argued, like O'Donnell, that one of the consequences of this weakness was kind of cycles of both enthusiasm or protest leading to enthusiasm for change, followed by disappointment and resignation and perhaps new protest. And in some ways you can see a similar cycle during the Nomi-hun period. There's the initial candlelight vigils after the accident up in Dongducheon in 2002, the candlelight vigils against Roe's impeachment, but then also a sense of disappointment with the troop dispatch to Iraq and the chorus FTA. Now, Nomi-hun did not fit the profile of a delegative leader, but this cycle of political emotion we associate with Che's argument did persist. Now, I wanted to make another argument that this form of delegative democracy isn't simply unique to those countries who have undergone a recent democratic transition, but resembles the kind of style we encounter globally these days. There's a little bit of a teleology with the argument that this only applies to transitional countries. And I want to say that it is a pattern we can see in many other places. And in a recent article, a few of my recent articles, I've applied a concept by Colin Crouch, which he calls post-democracy. He regards this Crouch argues that after a kind of high point of democratic enthusiasm in the sense of popular participation and by ordinary people, democracy has a tendency towards entropy, if not the kind of capture of its institutions by elite actors we might associate with pre-democratic times. Now, he describes this as a parabola-shaped process, but I think it's more important to sort of see it as a tendency that happens unless there's some form of repoliticization. And this sort of, in some ways, also encapsulates what we see with Trump. There is a sense of a kind of austere, a return of a more austere form of elite politics. Other features of post-democracy that are germane for the purposes here is one that also representative parties sort of cease to propose substantive alternatives to the status quo. And there's also, the political spectrum itself becomes kind of obscured. Once again, parties fail to accurately represent that distinction between right and left, where we may regard left as an egalitarian politics and right as a more consciously might is right, inegalitarian politics. And in an article, Sebum-ku and I talk about how there's different forms of post-democracy. Often it's associated with the rightward creep of social democratic parties in the West, such as Tony Blair's New Labour Party. But we may say there's been a more coercive version of it in Korea, represented by the Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye regimes, a much more coercive version where they have used a kind of red-baiting type politics, calling everything 정북자파, to kind of enforce this condition. And this is an article we wrote more recently. But what's, I think, really interesting about the candlelight protest is that in some ways, it's defied this trend. It's led to a moment of re-democratization, we might say. But how to understand it? How to understand it? So here I think we need to sort of better rethink this relationship between direct and representative democracy, as Eric indeed just suggested. Now, commenting on the 2008 anti-Macau protest, Choi Jung-jib sort of argues that in some ways there's a bad thing happening here. The sign of direct mobilization means that representative democracy has failed. And he regards the relationship between direct and representative democracy as in some ways ideal types and competing alternatives. It's either one or the other. And this has led to a lot of debate among progressive intellectuals. even in the current moment. I believe Che has currently been debating with other professors about this issue. But I think we should really avoid this kind of trap of seeing them as competing alternatives and ask instead, how are the two related? I say dialectically here, meaning that they're not opposites, but what kind of relation exists between them? So on the one hand, I think we can read the candlelight revolution as a kind of peaceful revolt against this delegative democratic style, one that's led to the reestablishment of a functioning liberal democracy and hopefully a functioning representative democracy. But when we talk about a new governance paradigm or a new political paradigm, I think candlelight democracy itself is something different. So I write here a tentative definition that we might consider candlelight democracy as a mediation through practice, through popular and elite political practice of both direct and representational forms of democracy. A journey perhaps that is engaged in by both political elites, political parties, and ordinary people. So not seeing them as competing alternatives, nor as simply the terrain of elite actors, but it's a kind of interaction. Kim Jin-po talks about how we need to move beyond the limits of representative democracy and increase direct democracy, but I think there's an opportunity here for the deepening of both systems and a kind of mutual interaction, if you will. I put this in graph form, so if you can think of a kind of two different parameters, direct democracy and elitist forms of delegative democracy, the candlelight revolution in some ways has led to this restoration of representative democracy. And candlelight democracy might be considered a kind of mediation between direct democracy and representative democracy. So a kind of a terrain of intervention by both popular political forces, NGOs, civil society, trade union movements, citizens movements, and elected officials, political parties, and whatnot. So, yes, a parallel deepening, if you will. I don't want to make too many prescriptions, but I think from the perspective of political parties, there's a desire now to pursue reforms that can enable participation. Some of that is a project of cleaning up some of the baggage of the last 10 years. So a more substantive reform of the prosecution and intelligence agencies after what we saw in the last election is definitely needed. But there's lots of other reforms that can be useful, and I'll focus more on the ones that I think that are related to labor and social welfare that I think are really important when we think about enabling participation and enabling interaction between direct and representative democracy. So one, this idea of creating wage-led growth, I think is a marvelous idea. Enhanced social welfare, kind of promoting the caring economy, if we think about the rights and benefits that can be enjoyed by ordinary people in terms of childcare, elder care, education. These are all very good steps. As a occasional labor studies scholar, I think there's many things that can also be done when it comes to the labor sector. So bringing up practices, labor relations to global norms is important here in terms of enabling the human rights of workers. Ratification of the ILO conventions on freedom of association and collective bargaining would be an excellent policy to pursue. But also ending some of the coercive practices that have shaped the governing of irregular work in Korea. For instance, the trade union movement, especially irregular workers, have long complained of coercive practices like 손해배상, the taking out of damage claims against workers for strikes or other forms of collective action. I guess my general point here is that in this parallel process of deepening representative democracy, of accurately representing the political spectrum, of highlighting issues of social injustice, inequality, and unfair play, it's going to be a difficult task, and there's a need for social partners. Certainly there's existing institutions, tripartite institutions with labor capital and government that one can work on, but there's also the issue of those who are not represented well in those institutions, those who are more likely to want to pursue direct mobilization because of their exclusion. And I think what the government can do is not kind of co-opt them, but listen to them and interact with these groups, learn from these more grassroots struggles, the struggles of women workers, migrant workers, and irregular workers, and to stimulate new policy ideas. So, by way of conclusion, one, I think it's important to learn from past events. We want to learn from these past cycles of enthusiasm to see what might happen in the future. I don't think we want to see what happened in the participatory government in the same way. I think too often back then, the idea of participatory government became just a legitimation of the government by including some democracy activists and not really a substantive deepening of representative democracy or direct democracy. Certainly the government should probably not call itself the candlelight government unless it wants to go down a similar cycle. Also, it's important to regard candlelight democracy, I think, as this kind of terrain of practice between direct political mobilization and the institutions of representative democracy. A terrain of practice that is not the sole domain of elites, but is one that is shared with ordinary people, civil society, and social movements. And yet, but other than that, I think it's a very hopeful time and an opportunity to kind of carry out these parallel reforms. And hopefully there's a lot, I'm sure there's a lot that is, as people challenging leaders like Donald Trump, processes like Brexit and such around the world, I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned here, and it's inspiring to watch. Thank you.